Okay, so next time we're going to be reading Kipling's The Man Who Would Be King. And that is going to kind of build on a lot of the material that we're going to talk about today. So keep the stuff we're doing today in mind as background for Kipling's story. Friday, response paper 6 is due. I'm also going to permit people to resubmit paper 1 to try to get a better grade. So here's what the rules are going to be for that, right? So first, right, I want you to take note of the feedback that I gave you on the paper and attempt to address it. Right? It might not be a bad idea to take it to the writing center and have them work with you on it. You are also free to ask me any questions that you have about the feedback that I gave you. So, if you then revise the paper to strengthen the argument and submit it by Friday night at midnight, you can improve your score by up to 1 full letter grade. Now, the amount of improvement will depend on how much better the paper is, right? So if you improve the paper significantly, then you will go up that 1 full letter grade. If you make small improvements, it'll go up half a letter grade. If the paper doesn't get better or somehow gets worse, there will be no change. I only mentioned that because sometimes that, it doesn't happen very often, but it does happen that somehow people manage to make the paper worse through revision. I don't anticipate that happening here, though. So the worst possible outcome is that your grade won't change, right? But if you really put some effort into this and do some serious revision, then you can pull your grade up to a full letter grade, right? So you can pull that C up to a B or that D up to a C or whatever, right? So does anybody have any questions about this? Does anybody have any questions about these potential revisions? Everything's clear? Okay, great. So just quickly reiterate again for those who just arrived, right? You have the opportunity to revise paper 1 for a better grade. If you go over the feedback, try to address it, and then resubmit the paper by Friday night, you can improve your grade by up to 1 full letter grade, right? Okay, other things to note. So we're back on our regular schedule again, right? So response paper 6 will be due on Friday, and there may be a quiz appearing on Georgia View Wednesday night, right? So be sure to look out for it. Other issues. I do also want to talk briefly about just some of the common issues people had with the midterm exam so that we can nip those in the bud for the final, right? Now, the good news about the midterm is that in the grand scheme of the course, it's not worth a lot of points, right? It's worth 10 out of 100, which is not insignificant, which is not crushing either, right? If you didn't do that well, you can still come back from it. By and large, people did all right with the IDs. Most of you managed to answer at least 6 of them and get them correct. The bigger issues that I saw were with the essay. And one of the problems was that most of you just wrote essays that weren't anywhere near long enough. You were asked for 750 words. From some of you, I only got about 200, right? The bigger issue with the essays was that most of you were only talking about one text when the questions were specifically asking you to compare texts, right? So
compare all of the text that you asked for?
no, but most of the questions will ask you about one text and then would say compare to one other course text, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you were expected in most of the questions to write about two texts. That would have, for one thing, given you more material to work with, right? So if you ran out of things to say at about 300, 400 words, if you had another text to write about, then you've got more material there, right? So keep that in mind for the final, right? That you are going to be asked to do comparative essays here, right? To talk about two texts. Remember too that all of the sample questions I gave you were comparative questions too, right? It was all, phrased in, compare and contrast, or it was asking to look at two texts together.
Plus, we on a certain time limit, so you wouldn't want us to take too much time on an essay.
No, because you have to finish both parts of the exam.
Right.
And I'm wondering if maybe the open book thing threw people off. Did people maybe spend too much time leafing through the book and not enough time writing? The other thing that I'm wondering about, there is some data that suggests that people do better on tests when they take the test in the place where they learned the material. And I'm wondering if putting the test online actually made it more difficult. So what I think we might do for the final, I don't like giving out, I don't like passing paper back and forth right now because I don't think it's entirely safe. But I think that for the final, we're just going to take it here. I will give you blue books to take the exam in. And maybe, maybe you'll have better recall of the material. Maybe you can, you'll be able to sort of think up things faster.
Maybe I know, how long was the midterm, 75?
750 words, yeah.
Or not saying time limit wise, how long?
Oh, 75 minutes. So it was the same amount of time you would have in class.
So
which is the amount of time you would have to take the test if you were here normally.
What if you split it up, let us do the essay for the first half and do the other half, for the rest of the time, so we won't have to rush since we know we're on a certain time thing. I feel like I rush. Doesn't
work that way. It has to be a timed exam. You have to get 2 hours for it.
No, I'm saying the first hour can be to the essay, the second hour can be for the remaining stuff.
Well, what we can do if we take it here instead of you taking it at home, I can give you a running countdown of how much time has elapsed, right? So then you have a better sense of what time you have left. I don't know if it gives you a countdown clock or anything when you're taking it online. Does it?
It does.
It does? Okay. But yeah, I feel maybe it will be easier for you to keep track of time if we're sitting here physically and I give you a warning every half hour or so.
Or if we say we're gonna end up doing it in class, if we're gonna do an essay part, I ain't saying give us the answer, but if you let us know what the writing prompts are, maybe we could before class we could probably start planning it out so we could have
and that's what the sample questions I gave you were for. Now I didn't give you the specific writing prompts because then I'm giving you the test ahead of time. I'm not going to do that.
Right.
But but what I was trying to do was at least give you some sense of what kinds of questions you would be asked to answer. So I don't know how many people looked at the writing prompts. I don't know how many people work with or the sample questions. I don't know how many of you tried to work with those. Maybe I didn't give them to you early enough. So I'll try to give you sample questions for the final a little earlier than I gave you the midterm sample questions. But yeah, I'm not going to give people the specific writing prompts early. That's just not going to happen. But I will give you questions that will focus on the themes that I want you to know. And I want you to then sort of think about texts that might fit those themes. And that'll help you prepare for what the essay questions will actually look like.
And for the original plans for the finals, were we gonna even be on campus? Was that the plans that the school had, or?
I don't really know or understand what the school's plan. I think they were expecting in-class finals, like just, you know, I think like as long as the class is not a hybrid class, which, you know, this class isn't big enough to need to do that, which frankly I'm thankful for, because that would be a massive pain in the ass. I think the expectation is that everything will kind of run as a normal class, the social distancing in place and all that. I think like this group is small enough that I think it's reasonably safe to take the exam in the classroom. If this is a bigger group, I would have more qualms about it. But because there are only 7 people still in the class, I don't think it's going to be that big an issue. Okay, so what we're going to be talking about today is Victorian colonialism, right? So I want to center our discussion around 3 events that are all relevant to the pieces that I asked you to read for today, right? The first is the Indian Mutiny in 1857. Now, what do we remember from our discussion of Romantic Orientalism about the way India was ruled from Britain in the early part of the 19th century? Who was actually in charge in India? Who actually ran the country?
Wasn't it like some guy? Or, well, that's more like what people worship.
Okay, you're thinking about the Jagannath ceremony.
Oh.
Yeah. So no, I mean, So it's not a god who runs the country, but there were people who were making money off of that festival. Does anyone remember who that was? Who was charging the pilgrim fees?
One of the people that lived there?
No. The British East India Company, right? Remember, right? India was a corporate fiefdom up until 1857, right? Right, remember, guys, that like this information is always going to come back, right? All of these things that we're reading are connected to each other, so you can't just kind of let it drift out of your memory once we're done talking about it. So the British East India Company ran India from the late 18th into the mid 19th centuries, right? Now, they made the number of Britons in India as a result was relatively small and was largely limited to company employees. To enforce its will, the British East India Company, by and large, hired native Indian troops. And in 1857, upset by years of poor treatment and low pay and domination by outsiders, a number of these troops revolted and attacked British outposts across India. And this resentment was bred not just out of British economic domination, but also British cultural domination. So if we look at the Thomas Babington Mcauley piece on page 686, so Mcauley was a historian, a member of Parliament, and also a member of the board of directors of the British East India Company. And he was part of a debate amongst the directors of the company about what course education in India should pursue in the 1830s, right? Specifically what the primary language of instruction should be and who should be educated. So this is sort of events leading up to the NBD, right? So let's look at what Mcauley has to say about Indian education. Can I get somebody to start reading from the Minute on Indian Education on page 686, starting with, "We come now to the gist of the matter."
We come now to the gist of the matter. We have a fund to be employed as government shall direct for the intellectual improvement of the people of this country. The simple question is, what is the most useful way of employing it? All parties seem to be agreed on one point, that the dialects commonly spoken among the natives of this part of India contain neither literary or scientific information and are moral, so poor and rude that until they are enriched,
You're good, yeah, until they are enriched from some other quarter, yeah.
Okay. It will not be easy to translate any valuable work into them. It seems to be admitted on all sides that the intellectual improvement of those classes of the people who have the means of pursuing higher studies can at present be effected only by means of some language not vernacular amongst them.
Mm-hmm.
What then shall the language be? One half of the committee maintained that it should be the English, the other half strongly recommended the Arabic and Sanskrit. The whole question seems to me to be which language is the best worth knowing.
Okay, you can stop there, thank you. So the way he's framing the debate, right, is the government has put aside this fund to pay for educational enterprises in India, right, for the British East India Company to have at their disposal to educate the populace, right? So does everybody understand what vernacular language is, what the word vernacular means?
Does that mean vocabulary?
No, well,
What do you mean?
vocabulary is part of it. Vernacular language is everyday language. So, for example, if you lived in France in the Middle Ages, right? Latin would be the language of high educated culture. But most ordinary people would be walking around speaking French, right? So French would be the vernacular language. So what he's referring to when he talks about vernacular languages is he's talking about the variety of languages and dialects within India, right? Because one of the particular problems that the British East India Company faced is that India is a polyglot country, right? That is, it's a country in which a number of different languages and dialects are spoken, right? There are a variety of different regions which speak different, they're called Prakrits. Right, an Indian vernacular language that's spoken regionally is called a Prakrit. Now, Sanskrit, which he refers to in his argument, is a literary and religious language. Right, the primary Hindu religious texts are all written in Sanskrit. Philosophical texts are written in Sanskrit. A lot of poetry and drama, right, written in Sanskrit. So Sanskrit is not, probably never has been anyone's everyday language, right? Sanskrit is a language that was used for specific literary and ritual purposes. But it is kind of like the language of high culture and education in India, right? So, the argument here between these two sides in the 1830s is whether it is better to educate the Indian public in English or in Sanskrit or Persian. Now, Mcauley says Arabic here. He actually means Persian because Arabic isn't really a language that's spoken in India. Persian is. But what does that suggest right off the bat? That he gets, that he gets the name of one of these languages wrong.
That he doesn't know them himself.
Yeah, that his knowledge of what he's talking about is maybe limited, right? That he doesn't actually have the information at his disposal to make a good decision about this. Can I get somebody to continue reading from, I have no knowledge of either Sanskrit or Arabic.
I have no knowledge of either Sanskrit or Arabic, but I have done what I could to form a correct estimate of their value. I have read translation of the most celebrated Arabic and Sanskrit work. I have conversed both here and at home with men distinguished by their proficiency in the Eastern tongue. I am quite ready to take the Oriental learning at the valuation of the Orientalists themselves. I have never found one among them who could deny that a single shelf of good European library was worth the whole native literature of India and Arabia. In intrinsic superiority of the Western literature is indeed fully admitted by those members of the committee who support the Oriental plan of education. Okay, so what's an Orientalist? Does anybody know what he means by this?
Is it kind of like a teacher or?
Well, an Orientalist is a scholar of a particular type, right? So an Orientalist is a scholar who studies Asian cultures. So when he's asking for the input of experts to help him devise this plan of education, is he asking people who actually live in the country or just Europeans who study it?
Europeans who study it.
Yeah, this is entirely developed by European scholars whose special subject of knowledge is Asian cultures, right? So he's not asking anybody in India necessarily what they want or what would be best for them, right? When he talks about all parties agreeing here, right, he's talking about all parties in the British East India Company, not all parties that have a stake in this plan, right? And why doesn't he have to get get consultation from or permission from the actual native people?
He's in charge, right?
Yeah, they're not in charge. It's up to him and his committee to decide what language they will be educated in, right? Now, we also see the development here in Macaulay's piece of a strong British sense of not just European, but of British cultural superiority, right? So one of the things that's happening over the course of the 19th century is we have a stronger sense of British national identity developing. In part through the process of empire building, right? What happens is that these four countries that make up Great Britain, right? Right, we have England, Wales, Scotland, and in the Victorian period, Ireland. though most of Ireland is now an independent country. And all of these four nations have separate cultural and, to an extent, separate linguistic identities. But in this period, the height of the power of the British Empire, there is a strong attempt to forge a kind of composite British identity in which Englishness becomes dominant, in large part because England is the biggest, wealthiest, and most powerful of these four nations, and has already been politically and culturally dominating the others for some time. And one of the interesting things about this is that this seems to be unevenly applied to British colonies, right? On the one hand, you have places like Canada and Australia that, while they are British dominions, are mostly self-governing. Then you have places like India and Uganda that are ruled or dominated by private corporations, and places like Jamaica that are what are referred to as crown colonies, that is, directly ruled by the British government. So we have a kind of hodgepodge of different approaches here. Now, what makes Canada and Australia, by the way, different from these other colonies, from India, Uganda, Jamaica, other such places? Right, but what is already different about Canada and Australia in the 19th century? About the population of these countries?
It's not so crowded? No, it is.
Well, I mean, Canada is still pretty... There's a lot of empty space in Canada, right?
Yeah, I think a lot of people live down there.
Yeah. It's more about who lives there. Canada and Australia, by this point, are peopled mostly by British settlers who have displaced the indigenous populations, right? So the majority populations in Canada and Australia are white, the British. In most of these other colonies, Britons form a very small minority. And thus, as we see in descriptions of the Indian Mutiny, they often feel like a threatened minority, right? So they often come down with a kind of heavy policy hand to promote Britishness and British interests. Like, so if we turn away from Mcauley for a moment and we look at William Howard Russell's description of conditions leading up to the Indian Mutiny on page 691. He's describing this British outpost called Cawnpore that has been destroyed by Indian troops. Among those heaps of dust and ashes, those arid mounds of brick, those new-made trenches, I try in vain to realize what was once this station of Cawnpore. The solemn etiquette, the visits to the brigadier and the general en grand tenue, the invitations to dinner, the white kid gloves, the balls, the liveries, the affectation of the plusot de hoton, the millinery anxieties of the ladies, the ices and champagne and supper, the golden-robed Nana Sahib moving about amid haughty stares and ill-concealed dislike. What the deuce does the general ask that N-word here for? The little and big flirtations, the drives on the road, a dull, ceremonious pleasure, the faded fun of the private theatricals, the exotic absurdities of Masonic revels, the marryings and givings in marriage, the little bills done by the rich Benays, the small and great pecuniary relations between the station and the bazaar, the sense of security. And then, on all this exaggerated relief of an English garrison town and watering place, the deep gloom of apprehension. At first a shave of old Smiths, then a well-authenticated report, then a certainty of disaffection, rolling like thunder clouds and darkening the glassy surface of the gay society till it burst on it in stormy and cruel reality. But I cannot. So let's sort of pick apart the picture that Russell presents of what British life was like in India before the mutiny. What kinds of things does he focus on in this paragraph? What does he tell us about what people were doing?
It sounds like when he said the invitations to the dinner, stuff like that.
Uh-huh.
He said the black people, it sounds like, I guess they were living pretty nice out there.
Yeah, having fancy parties, right? Right, fancy dinner parties, private theatricals, so people having plays performed in their own study drawing rooms, right? Fancy dinner parties, private theatricals. People wearing white kid gloves and drinking champagne. So, does he paint a picture of people, of British people, acting like they are in a different country or any kind of different context? Or does it look like they're building around themselves a kind of mini Britain, or a kind of little island of Britishness in India?
Probably so, by the way they're living and acting. So,
Yeah, I mean, think about the way they talk about the Indian leader who is invited as a matter of course to these things, right? They resent him. They resent his presence there, right? Because he's a reminder that this isn't Britain, right? Now we can compare this to T.M. Mukherjee's description of his reception in England about 30 years later, where he's invited into the homes of respectable families, right? But they're on their home turf. The Nana Sahib, in Russell's account, is a reminder that this isn't Britain, right? And that while they may be in charge, there are other forces that they have to negotiate with, right? There are other players in the game with whom they must contend, right? So, to return to Mcauley, so Mcauley has been stressing the superiority of English as a language of literature and culture, right? Now, we can compare this back to William Jones at the end of the 18th century. We might remember Jones from our discussion of Romanticism and its approach to Asia, right? Jones was that scholar of languages, who noticed that Sanskrit was actually very similar to Greek and Latin. And so Jones's attitude was that there was a great deal that European scholars and Indian scholars could learn from each other, right? And that there should be more Sanskrit books translated for European audiences and in European libraries, right? Now Mcauley seems to be taking the opposite position, right? On page 687 here, he's at the top here, right? It will hardly be disputed, I suppose, that the department of literature in which the Eastern writers stand highest is poetry. And I certainly never met with any Orientalist who ventured to maintain that the Arabic and Sanskrit poetry could be compared to that of the great European nations. But when we pass from works of imagination to works in which facts are recorded and general principles investigated, the superiority of the Europeans becomes absolutely immeasurable. It is, I believe, no exaggeration to say that all the historical information which has been collected from all the books written in the Sanskrit language is less valuable than what may be found in the most paltry abridgments used at preparatory schools in England. In every branch of physical or moral philosophy, the relative position of the two nations is nearly the same. So ultimately then, what is his argument for educating Indians in English rather than in Sanskrit or Persian?
That it won't be much useful to them, is that what he was trying to say? Or
That what won't be much use to them?
like learning that English, it won't be much useful?
Does he think English won't be useful to them? What does he think about the position of English relative to Sanskrit?
Oh, never mind.
Yeah, he's arguing that English is way better in every respect, right? That everything about English is better than Sanskrit. English poetry is better, English philosophy is better, English science is better, right? So why not teach people in the language that he's associating with cultural and academic superiority, right? But there's another element to his argument that's a little bit sneakier, that comes in closer to the end. Now remember, what is the British East India Company? What are they? What's their purpose in India?
To make decisions for everybody.
But to what ultimate end? What do they want out of India?
They're trying to improve it? Or making
Does the British East India Company necessarily really want to improve India? Remember, they're a private corporation, right? So what do they actually want?
money?
They want to make money, right? Their primary goal is to make a profit, right? Hence, remember, right, they were charging those pilgrim fees to people who wanted to go to the Jagannath ceremony, right? And that was one of the things that Claudius Buchanan was so mad about. It's like, you're making money off of these, non-Christian ceremonies, and this should not be, and all that, right? So their primary purpose is to make money. And if we look towards the bottom of page 687, so he talks all this high-minded but still kind of racist stuff about, how giving people access to the best that has been known and thought. And then, near the bottom of that long paragraph, he says, "Nor is this all. English is the language spoken by the ruling class. It is spoken by the higher class of natives at the seats of government. It is likely to become the language of commerce throughout the seas of the East. It is the language of two great European communities which are rising, the one in the south of Africa, the other in Australasia, communities which are every year becoming more important and more closely connected with our Indian Empire. When we look at the intrinsic value of our literature at the particular situation of this country, we shall see the strongest reason to think that, of all foreign tongues, the English tongue is that which would be most useful to our native subjects." So on the one hand, he's thinking about connections between different parts of the British Empire, right? We want British subjects in different parts of the world speaking the same language for one important purpose: commerce. Right? He says that English is becoming the language of commerce in this part of the world. If everybody speaks the same language, trade becomes easier. So if you can educate a particular class of persons to speak English, in different parts of the empire, right? Not only might they come to align themselves with your interests, right? But it will help ease trade. So that's a big part of what Mcauley really wants here, right, is to keep the money flowing from colony to colony here, right? To make it easier to move goods back and forth, to ease the path to trade. Now, I'd like to look at T.N. Mukherjee's piece as well, because this is a response by an Indian to British efforts to promote imperial unity, right? So Mukherjee was a high caste Indian, highly educated, relatively wealthy background, who came to England as part of the delegation sent from India in 1886 for what was called the Colonial and Indian Exhibition. So let's talk a little bit about what this was and what this looked like. How many of you are familiar with the idea of a World's Fair? A World's Fair?
I think I went, no, I don't know if that's something, but they have like, is it like when you go to like the place and they have like different things from different countries?
Yeah. So like different countries will have maybe
Like International Day? That's what they would call what she talked
Oh,
about.
okay, yeah. So like a World's Fair would be a more kind of official kind of thing. They're bigger productions. Like a city is chosen to host it, and different countries come and they set up pavilions, right? And you go to that pavilion, and you're given examples of sort of like the culture and handicrafts and whatnot of that particular country. So another good example of something like this might be, I don't know if any of you are familiar with like the World Showcase at Epcot Center at Disney World, right? Where Norway and Mexico are next to each other. And like each pavilion has a restaurant and a gift shop where you can buy stuff that's supposedly from that country, right? And one thing that the Colonial Indian Exhibition did not feature certainly was rides, right? But they did give each nation within the British Empire its own little pavilion. Actually relatively large. This is actually a pretty big setup in London. They would bring plants and food from their country. They would give you examples of folk songs and things like that, handicrafts. So this is a drawing of the Jamaica Pavilion from that exhibition. And this is the gate that was constructed to lead into the India Pavilion. So, like, these weren't just like little tables in a gymnasium, right? This was meant to showcase the cultural riches of the empire, right? And it was an attempt to demonstrate the diversity inherent in Britishness, right? The idea is to try to show that all of these disparate nations are also British subjects, right? And to make people living in Britain more aware of what's happening in British colonies elsewhere. And here we have, I'm not sure exactly which country this illustrates. It's a West African country. They're demonstrating like essentially how you extract diamonds from dirt, right? So this is an example of the kind of thing you would see if you went to this colonial exhibition, right? You would see that people usually would be in their native dress, and they would be performing the kind of work that they would be doing at home, or at least some version of it. Usually they would choose like the most visually interesting and dramatic forms of work, right? So for example, in the India Pavilion, they had guys weaving carpets and singing the work song that goes along with that and that sort of thing, right? So a lot of the notions of Indianness and West Africanness and Jamaicanness and whatever that Britons would be getting from this would be based a little bit in stereotype, would often kind of reinforce certain stereotypes they might have already had. And even we see from Mukherjee that even sometimes attempts to be welcoming are a little bit backhanded and backfire a little bit. So let's look at Mukherjee's account. I think it's important to note as we read him that he's writing for two different audiences. So on the one hand, Mukherjee is writing newspaper reports to be published in India. So he is reporting on the exhibition for an audience back home, right? To give them some sense of this big thing that's going on in London. But he's also preparing a book for an English audience. And he's writing the whole thing in English in part because one thing that was a result of Mcauley's educational initiative is that it did mean that the higher classes of Indians became fluent in English. And it was easier to reach a wider audience in India by writing in English than by writing in one of the native dialects, which would only reach people in a particular region. This is an issue we'll see Salman Rushdie talk about near the end of the semester, the status of English within India. But what this means is that Mukherjee has to walk a kind of delicate balance here, right? That he has to provide entertaining anecdotes about England and about English people for the audience back home. But he also has to do it without really offending his English hosts, right? So let's look at how he accomplishes this. If we look on page 702, the first paragraph here, right? Another place of considerable interest to the natives of England was the Indian Bazaar, where Hindu and Muhammadan artisans carried on their avocations, to witness which men, women, and children flocked from all parts of the kingdom. A dense crowd always stood there, looking at our men as they wove the gold brocade, sang the patterns of the carpet, and printed the calico with the hand. They were as much astonished to see the Indians produce works of art with the aid of rude apparatus they themselves discarded long ago, as a Hindu would be to see a chimpanzee officiating as a priest in a funeral ceremony and reading out Sanskrit texts from a palm leaf book spread before him. We were very interesting beings, no doubt. So were the Zulus before us, and so is the Sioux chief at the present time. So there's a kind of sarcasm in a lot of this, right?
Yeah, I was hoping so. I'm like, what you mean chimpanzee reading something?
Yeah, well, and I think what he's talking about here is the tendency of the British public to get excited by novelties and the treating of entire nations of people as though they're one of these peculiar novelties, right? So it's like, yeah, they were fascinated by us, just like they were fascinated by the Zulus before, and just like they're fascinated by the Sioux chief from America now, right? That, on the one hand, it's a knock at the British attention span, and a knock at the British attitude towards other cultures. That it's entertainment to them, right? It's just, something to they can amuse themselves with on a Saturday afternoon. Now, human nature everywhere thirsts for novelty, and measures out its favors in proportion to the rarity and oddity of a thing. It was from the ladies that we received the largest amount of patronage. We were pierced through and through by stares from eyes of all colors, green, gray, blue, and black. And every movement and act of ours, walking, sitting, eating, reading, received its full share of, "Oh, I never." The number of wives we left behind at home was also a constant theme of speculation among them, and shrewd guesses were sometimes made on this point, 250 being a favorite number. You could tell any amount of stories in this subject without exciting the slightest suspicion. Once, one of our number told a pretty waitress, "I am awfully pleased with you and I want to marry you. Will you accept the 40th wifeship in my household, which became vacant just before I left my country?" She asked, "How many wives have you altogether?" 250, the usual number, was the ready answer. "What became of your wife number 40? "I killed her because one morning she could not cook my porridge well." The poor girl was horrified and exclaimed, "Oh, you monster, oh, you wretch." Right, so the guy doesn't really have 250 wives, right? And he didn't really kill wife number 40 because she didn't cook his porridge correctly. What's he doing with this waitress?
I mean, first, I guess.
Is he trying to impress her?
It's not like he's trying to maybe scare her away or get away from him.
I think it's actually, it's less hostile than that. He's just messing with her, right? Essentially what he's doing is making a joke, right? Playing on her ignorance of actual cultural practices in his country, right? He's having fun with her because he knows that she believes things about him and about his country that aren't true, right? So he plays into those stereotypes to get a rise out of her. And this is the primary theme that we see emerging from Mukherjee's piece, right? Is the way Indians are more clever than the English and are able to use English ignorance to amuse themselves. Right, so we have this joke about the wives, right? We also see on page 703, in public matters, non-official gentlemen were also very partial to us. We want to hear the turbaned gentleman, was the wish often and often expressed. But we cease not to be a prodigious wonder to strangers and to the common people. Would they discuss us so freely if they knew that we understood their language? So we can relate this back to Clarkson's imaginary conversation with the African, right? And what was Clarkson's big complaint about British people in regards to the slave trade?
They didn't care about the slaves.
The beliefs of Christianity.
Okay, yeah. And he also regarded the slave trade as more like people were kind of willfully blind to it, right? That even, if people didn't approve of it, they just kind of pretended it wasn't happening because they wanted to keep sweetening their tea, right? They wanted to keep that sweet, sweet sugar flowing. So in order to have that happen, they just kind of turn and look the other way, right? I don't need to know about this. I don't need to know this is going on. And the same level of relative ignorance is what Mukherjee exploits here, often for the sake of fun, right? But the other thing we need to notice is the way he balances these audiences together, right? The way he balances the Indian and the English audience. So making fun of English people is clearly for the Indian audience, right? That's primarily speaking to people at home. Does he seem to regard all English people as laughable and worthy of contempt? If we look at the paragraph above this one, right? We're told utmost indulgence was shown to us everywhere, right? Her Majesty was graciously pleased to lay aside the usual rules, and his favor was shown us wherever we went. Gentlemen and ladies of high education and culture, however, honored us as the representatives of the most ancient nation now existing on the face of the earth. They would frequently ask us home, get up private parties, and arrange for all sorts of amusements. In other houses, we grew more intimate and formed part of the family party. To these, we were always welcome and could come and go whenever we liked. We got some friends among them, and these gentlemen would often come and fetch us home if we absented ourselves for more than the ordinary length of time. I fondly remember the happy days I passed with them, and feel thankful for the kindness they showed me during my sojourn in their country. So what's the difference between these people who are inviting him into their homes and treating with them on equal terms, and people like the woman they tried to mess with at the pavilion with the joke about the wives?
They're more open and they're not judging him based off of where he's from.
Okay. Although they are primarily interested in him because of where he's from, right?
They would rather know than to assume about what they do.
Okay, but think about something that's less like a difference in ideas and more a difference in, say, like level of education or culture, right? What did the girl they were messing with at the pavilion do for a living?
She's a waitress.
She's a waitress, yeah. Is he being invited to dine in the homes of waitresses and laborers and farmers? Yeah, the people who are showing him this favor are by and large of the upper classes, right? He talks about, gentlemen and ladies of education and rank, right? So he makes a class distinction here between different kinds of Brits. And I think this is how he avoids offending the English readers who are most likely to read his book, right? That the ridiculous Britons tend to come from the working classes, while the nice ones, and even the ridiculous ones aren't unpleasant or mean, right? They're just they're ignorant, right? They're presented as ignorant. Whereas people from the respectable classes are more willing to treat him as an equal, right? Now, if we look for an example of this on page 704, right? If we were interesting beings in the eyes of Londoners, who had oftener opportunities of seeing their fellow subjects from the Far East, how much more would we be so to the simple villagers who came by the thousands to see the wonders of the exhibition? Their conduct towards us was always kind and respectful. They liked to talk to us, and whenever convenient, we tried to satisfy their curiosity. Men, women, and children, whose relations are in India serving as soldiers or in any other capacity, would come through the crowd, all panting, to shake hands with us and ask about their friends. Many queer incidents happened in this way. Do you know James Robinson, of blank regiment? Asked a fat elderly woman, who one day came bustling through the crowd and took me by storm without any of those preliminary maneuvers usually adopted to open a conversation with a stranger. I expressed my regret in not having the honor of Jim's acquaintance. The good old lady then explained to me that she was Jim's aunt and gave me a long history of her nephew and the circumstances which led to his enlistment as a soldier. If the truant nephew lost the golden opportunity of sending through us his dutiful message to his aunt, she on her part was not wanting in her affectionate remembrances of him. Among other things, most of which I did not understand, for she did not speak the English we ordinarily hear, nor was her language quite coherent at the time, she begged me to carry to Jim the important intelligence that Mrs. Jones's fat pig obtained a prize at the Smithfield Agricultural Show. So, on what grounds is he making fun of this woman? What assumption has she made? Yeah, that obviously, because her nephew is in India, right? And this guy is from India, they must know each other. Right? So, clearly she has no concept of how big a country India is. Right?
Probably think it's really small.
Yeah, and the indication that we get from her conversation is that her world is relatively small, right? The most important thing that she can think of to report to her nephew is this local woman raising a prize pig, right? So he's kind of making, like, on the one hand, like, this episode, it's intended to be kind of critical of provincial English people who don't really see the world outside their own villages, or, you know, make an effort to learn about it. But it's also pretty condescending on his part, right? That he's making fun of this woman who, through no real fault of her own, has a relatively limited experience of the world, right? So there's something a little bit classist in a lot of what he says here as well. So while he's encountering a good deal of racism and a good deal of ignorance from the people that he's running into, he can also be kind of condescending as well. I think it's part of this balancing act between audiences, right? So I think he's assuming a comparatively, like, upper to upper middle class audience. Now, I did mention that I wanted to kind of structure today's discussion around 3 events, and we've really only talked about 2, time being the issue here. So we have the Indian Mutiny in 1857, which is the direct result of a lot of the cultural imperialist policies put in place by people like Mcauley, right? And the attempts of Britons in the country at the time, not only to continue to extract profit from the country, but also to build their own little mini Englands within it, right? And kind of ignoring what's going on around them. We've talked about the Colonial and Indian Exhibition and its attempt to present to citizens of Britain proper a picture of what life is like in British colonies, and also to try to get people in those colonies to think of themselves as British subjects. The Berlin Conference, we'll just kind of mention this in brief and then let you go, just so you know what was going on here, because it is also a very important part of the Victorian imperial story, right? So in 1884, the nations of Europe meet in Berlin to divide up spheres of influence in Africa. Basically, they get together, their representatives sit around a table, and they carve up the continent together. Right? You can imagine a bunch of guys with, you know, big bushy white mustaches sitting around a table with a map, drawing circles around the area that they claim, right? So Britain, along with other nations, Germany, Italy, France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Denmark, like nations that we don't think of as imperialist countries, they're sitting together and deciding amongst themselves who gets what parts of Africa. And this itself is a key difference from what was happening in the days of the slave trade, right? A big part of what's going on here is that with the abolition of the slave trade in the 1830s, European nations actually lose a lot of their influence in Africa, right? Because they were trading at the time with sovereign nations for slaves. So now that they can't do that anymore, what they start to do is colonize. Right. They're sending first explorers then traders, then missionaries, then soldiers into Africa and carving out territory for themselves. And all kind of in collusion with each other, right? So this is a kind of pan-European effort to carve up the African continent. And we'll see a lot of the results of this stuff won't play out for us until later, but we will see material that is directly related to the Indian contexts we're talking about in Kipling for next time. So does anybody have any questions about anything?
When they had the when they was talking about that massacre at how do you say it?
Kanpur, yeah.
What if I read correctly? Wasn't they saying like the slaves, or was it African Americans? Wasn't they attacking more?
No, the people who revolted weren't slaves, and remember too that we're talking about British people here, so there are no African Americans involved, right? So the usual term when we're talking about people of African descent in a British context is capital B black. That's usually the accepted term within kind of British discourse. Now, the people who are attacking the post at Kanpur, though, are not African at all.
Oh.
They're Indian.
Oh. I don't know. Maybe it's just the way they describe them.
Okay, I think I know what's throwing you off, is that he describes them as dark-skinned, right? And he also uses the N-word to refer to that native leader, right?
Yeah, so I just assumed that was happening.
And I think, one thing I will point out is that the usage of that word was, like, in the American context, has tended to be pretty specific, right? Mm-hmm. It's been directed primarily at, pretty much exclusively at people of African descent. The British used that word much more indiscriminately. To refer to virtually any indigenous population, particularly if that indigenous population was dark-skinned. So yeah, when they're using that word, they're talking about Indians in that context.
Okay.
But they would also use that word to talk about Africans, to talk about the Burmese, to talk about Australian Aborigines, right? They're apply it much more broadly.
That's just the way, like you said, the way they were describing it, it just sounded like it.
Yeah. Well, and yeah, they, like I said, in a lot of ways, they often fail to differentiate much between different subject populations. So, okay, so that's all I have for you. I only have paper towels to work with today, so there's only 3 of you. I'll clean up the desks. Don't worry about it. So just go ahead, and we'll see you on Thursday.